joining us tonight is a special member of the museum's family. Mike Thonis is a Museum of Science trustee and the chair of the Discoverers Committee. In 2007, he created a very unique fundraiser for the museum, the Washburn Climb. It's a challenge to climb Mount Washington twice in one day. Mike chose this particular mountain because of its close connection with the museum's late founding director, Brad Washburn. Brad had created a map of Mount Washington that is still used by climbers today. And Mike's efforts have been very successful. In 2001, the museum celebrated the 5th anniversary of the climb with record-breaking attendance. And tonight in the audience, I think we have about 20 of the Washburn climbers. So welcome, and we're excited that they're all here. So we're really happy to have Mike here to introduce the program, and I'm going to now turn things over to him.
Thank you, Lisa. Excuse me, those of you who know me know I love hearing about great mountaineering legends. In fact, the first real book I ever read was Annapurna, and which is an odd thing for a kid to read first. But someone gave it to me, and it's the only book I had. But it caught my attention, and I think tonight we've got a guest that embodies that and has written about that, and he'll tell you more. So I have so tonight all of us have the privilege to learn about an important chapter in climbing history from what is really a superb scientist, scholar, and storyteller. Wade Davis, he's an ethnographer, a writer, a photographer, a filmmaker, I mean the real deal, and an adventurer himself. At the age of 20, that was in recent times, he crossed the Darien Gap on foot in the company of the celebrated English author and explorer Sebastian Snow. Now, not all of us know what the Darien Gap is, but it's where the Pan-American Highway where it stops and takes a break before picking up again in South America. So it's 99 miles of swamp and forest in Panama and Colombia. And you can really only do it by foot, although I think some people have done it in sort of these specialized cars. But to have done that with Sebastian Snow is a remarkable feat. In graduate school with Richard Schultz, the father of ethnobotany, Wade spent over 3 years in the Amazon and the Andes as a plant explorer, living among 15 indigenous groups while collecting 6,000 botanical specimens. Later, he worked in Haiti to figure out whether zombies really existed. Not only did he confirm their existence, this is true, but he also figured out the ingredients in the mysterious powder that creates them. Provocative, you can check it out. He wrote a best-selling book about the experience called The Serpent and the Rainbow, and saw his story made into a popular feature film by Universal Pictures. 14 books and many films later, and with numerous awards to his credit, like the Explorer's Medal, the highest award given by the Explorers Club, Wade presents his new book, Into the Silence, The Great War, Mallory, and the Conquest of Everest. It has received rave reviews in the UK and the US, and has just been shortlisted as a finalist for the Charles Taylor Prize. I know we've got a few Canadians in the room here, which is Canada's equivalent to the Pulitzer Prize. Many of us are familiar with George Mallory's daring tale, but Wade gives it to us from a new perspective, a very new perspective, a view inside Mallory's generation and the historical context that produced these extraordinary mountaineers. So please join me in welcoming to the Museum of Science, Wade Davis.
Well, thanks very much, Mike. It's wonderful to be here in a building that, in a sense, was built by one of my heroes, Brad Washburn. And it's particularly nice that Lisa, an old friend, invited me to do this and to speak of this story. And I really want to begin by giving you a sense of the context. Everything you know about your life, every sense of doubt, every intuition that tells you that Freud, Darwin, Einstein were right, every hesitation and existential conundrum, in some sense, was born in the mud and blood of Flanders. For over a century, Europe had been at peace, even as industrial miracles created military power beyond anything that had ever been known. The European powers had spliced up the continents of the world until the boundaries of imperial ambition came together to choke off the heart of civilization. And then a single bullet fired into the breast of a prince in Sarajevo sparked the greatest cataclysm in the history of humanity. Americans tend to think of the First World War as being their war, forgetting that, in a sense, the Second World War, as Churchill famously said, was but the child of the First. He called it the 30 Years' War. He famously said that never was there a war less necessary to fight or more essential to win, less necessary to fight than the first, or more essential to win than the second. And that's really the backdrop, that fulcrum of history that created modernity, is the lever upon which the story really turns. Now, the genesis of this, my interest in this story, began in the spring of 1996 when I traveled 4,000 miles overland from Chengdu in western China through southeastern Tibet to Lhasa and on to Kathmandu as part of an ecological survey. And of course, that was a fateful spring when the debacle happened on Everest that John Krakauer so powerfully wrote about in his book, Into Thin Air. And with me on that journey was a close friend of mine, Daniel Taylor, who was a son and grandson of medical missionaries. Daniel's father had been the first to join, or he was on the first authorized expedition to enter Nepal. And he also had been a very close friend of Howard Somerville, who was Mallory's closest friend on the mountain. And so Daniel had grown up on stories of these expeditions. And the current, somewhat ignoble, indeed sordid scene of the commercialization of the mountain that had resulted in such tragic loss of life left Daniel somewhat disturbed and disappointed. And the very next fall, in November of 1997, Daniel and I returned to the east face of Everest, to the Gama Valley, the Kanchung face, to try to photograph for the National Geographic clouded leopards and snow leopards. And we got caught in unusual snow conditions, and we actually felt that we might not get out of the valley for the winter. And Daniel, in his remarkable way, began to speak of these Englishmen who wore tweed and read Shakespeare to each other in the snow at 23,000 feet. And I became completely enamored as an Anglophile. And interestingly, what interested me from the very start was not whether Mallory reached the top or not before he succumbed, but what was the spirit that carried him on. I knew, I guess because I'm Canadian, because my own grandfather was at the front, in fact, both my grandparents' fathers were at the front, that all of these men who went to Everest on those three expeditions in 1921, 1922, and 1924, because of their age, their class, their background, there was a good chance that they'd gone through the agony of the Western Front. Now, for those of you who don't know this story, of course, the British had set out in 1921 to find a mountain that no European had come to close quarters with, walking 400 miles off the map just to get to the flanks of Everest. They reconnoitered the mountain in 1921, returned in 1922 and 24, and fatefully on June 8, 1924, George Mallory, aged 37, the most illustrious climber in the British Empire, and his young protege, Sandy Irvine, a school lad from Oxford, just 22, were seen by Noel Odell cresting the northeast ridge of Everest, going strong for the top when the mist rolled in and enveloped their memory in myth, and neither one was ever seen again. But I knew that there was a good chance that these men had gone through the agony of the war, and my thought was not that they were cavalier about death, but that they would have seen so much of death that it had no mystery for them. It had nothing more to teach them save that of their own, and that it allowed them to accept a level of risk on the mountain that would have been unimaginable before the war. And so that was really the idea that I set out to explore. And to do that, I wanted to find out where each one of the 26 men who were part of those expeditions lived and were for every single day of the 4 years and 4 months of the Western Front, and that may explain why this book took 12 years to write. It was famously said of both the Passchendaele and the Somme that the British Army lacked the clerk power to tabulate the dead, but if that was true, they kept records of just about everything else. This war was so thoroughly documented that it's amazing men found time to fight. And not only was it documented in regimental diaries, we forget how small the British zone of operations was. The entire British sector of the Western Front in the Great War was never longer than 125 miles. For much of the war, it was as short as 85 miles. Behind that frontage, they would build 6,000 miles of trenches, 6,000 miles of railroad. The Ypres salient, this bulged in a line around the old medieval cloth town of Ypres in Belgium, a salient that a healthy man could walk around in a day, 4 miles by 12 miles. Within that bulge, that cauldron of death, 1.7 million boys from both sides would die or be severely wounded in the course of the war. And because the zone of operations was so small, and because in the wake of the war, a decade later, there was this flood, this cathartic flood of memoirs and journals and letters. There was no corner of that battle zone that was not documented in multiple voices on every single day of the war, in both poetry and prose, in the bombastic boast of a Yorkshire sergeant, or in the haunted cries of a young subaltern shattered in shell shock. So over the course of a decade of research, visiting over 80 archives, visiting all the families of the protagonists in the expeditions, I was able to literally discover, with a level of specificity that I would have thought impossible before I began the project, not only where each one of our men was every day of the war, but also I was able to ascertain with great accuracy exactly what they would have been exposed to. And this process of research in its own way reminded me of Siegfried Sassoon's famous description of shell shock as a twilight journey through a memory of hell. Now think about this. At the outbreak of the war, you had to stand 5'8" to be recruited into the British Army in August of 1914. By November, men 5'3" were eagerly recruited to the slaughter. Cremation, as a way of dealing with the dead, did not exist in the British Empire before the war. After the war, it became the preferred form of dealing with the dead for countless tens of thousands of men who had lived 4 years and 4 months with a rotten stench of corpses in no man's land. Plastic surgery was born of the war, and the need to repair, to the extent possible, the shell-scarred faces of young boys who for the rest of their lives would live behind masks, attending special holiday camps where they could remove the mask to feel the feel of the wind on their gargoyle features without fear of humiliation or shame. The British Army, the Royal Army Medical Corps, would require 108 million battle dressings during the war, but also 22,386 artificial eyes. The regular British Army in the entire empire required each year 2,500 shovels. In the mud of Flanders, 10 million would be requisitioned. Throughout the war, 25,000 Welsh and Scottish coal miners lived beneath ground, tunneling under the enemy lines to detonate massive charges of TNT that resonated over Hampstead Heath and the downs of southern England. Each month, the British Army, now think about this, in the 10 years of the Iraq conflict, the United States has lost 4,500 men, dead, and women. That, in the first war, was roughly the average mortality for a single week, for a war that went on 4 years and 4 months. Every single month, the British Army required 10,000 new subalterns to replace the junior officers slaughtered at the front. And what that meant was that public schools like Charterhouse, where Mallory had taught, Winchester, where he attended as a young boy, Uppingham, Harrow, Eton, literally graduated their senior and sometimes their junior classes, not to Oxford or Cambridge, which didn't see a single entry during the war, but directly to the horror of the front. Marlborough, where Geoffrey Winthrop Young attended school, had no fewer than 733 old boys slaughtered at the front. Nearly 1 million dead in Britain alone, 2.5 million wounded, 40,000 amputees, 60,000 men without sight, 65,000 men who never recovered from the horror of shell shock. Ivor Gurney, the poet, famously lived in an asylum until 1937, still certain that the war still raged. And in the immediate wake of peace, when he remained lucid, he actually walked across England to Liverpool just to find a ship that could take him anywhere, just to get away from the madness. In the wake of the peace, taxes and death duties created such economic agonies in Britain that more land changed hands in the first 2 years of peace than had done so at any time in the history of the United Kingdom since the Norman conquest. Women spoke about the war in the metaphor of dance. Nancy Cooper famously said, by the end of 1916, every boy I'd ever danced with was dead. Vera Brittain, who lost her fiancé, her brother, and her 2 best male friends, simply said there was no one left to dance with. Stephen Spender, the poet, said that after the war, the British middle class continued to dance, unaware that the dance floor had fallen out from beneath them. So if the quest for Mount Everest began as a grand imperial gesture, a gesture of redemption for an empire of explorers who had famously lost the race to the North and South Poles, in the wake of the war, it became a mission of regeneration for an entire empire bled white by the war. Of the 26 men who went to Everest on those expeditions, 6 escaped the war. Sandy Irvine, famously too young, Harold Rayburn and Arthur Kellis, too old. Guy Bullock was a diplomat, but Beetham sat out the war as a schoolmaster in Scotland, and Tom Longstaff sat out the war in India. But 20 of them most assuredly did see the fighting. 6 were themselves severely wounded, including Jack Hazard, who crested the North Col in 1924 with open, bleeding wounds from the Somme, saturating the cloth of his climbing tunic, even as he crested the North Col. 2 had been nearly killed by disease at the front. John Noel, the famous photographer, familiar to many of you, who went to his death as the last survivor of this generation, telling anyone who would ask him about his glorious years as a soldier at the front. In fact, never really saw the front. He spent the entire war in an asylum suffering from shell shock, something that he never told even his own daughter. 4 as surgeons dealt all through the war with the agony of the dying. 2 lost brothers. All had endured the slaughter, the coughing of the guns, the bones and barbed wire, the white faces of the dead. In August of 1917, Winthrop Young, who was Mallory's mentor and probably the greatest climber of his generation, recorded in his diary a list of friends who had been killed in the war. These numbered 25, and that left room for his acquaintances. These were another 25. And Young had been at the Belgium crossroads town of Ypres on April 22nd, 1915, when only the suicidal defense of the Canadians held a line as the Germans attacked for the first time in human history using poison gas. And this is what Young wrote in his diary that night. This horror was too monstrous to believe at first, but when it came, far as we had traveled from our civilized world of a few months back, the savagery of it, of the sight of men choking to death with yellow froth, lying on the floor and out on the fields, made me rage with an anger which no later cruelty of man, not even the degradation of our kind by the hideous concentration camps in later Germany, ever quite rekindled. For then we still thought all men were human. And Young was the mentor of Mallory, and in one of the kind of remarkable moments of discovery in the research process, I learned that on the very day that Sandy Irvine and George Mallory disappeared on the northeast ridge of Everest, there was another climb in the British Empire, a more modest peak in the Lake District known as the most beautiful of all the English hills, the Great Gable. And this was led by Arthur Wakefield, who had been a surgeon on the 1922 Everest expedition. And with him was Geoffrey Winthrop Young, who was there to give the oration in honor of all the men of the Fell and Rock Climbing Club who had been killed in the war. This was the first time that Young himself had managed to scramble up a peak since losing his leg to an Austrian shell on the Italian front in 1917. And so he came up the ridge supported by his wife and one of her friends in winds so fierce it swept the cape from his back. The plaque itself was covered by a Union Jack that had flown on the bridge of the battleship Barnum that had fought at the Battle of Jutland. And Wakefield stepped forth to speak to the congregation. And he spoke of the Moor, the spirit of the Moor, the spirit of self-sacrifice that had led them all, even at the risk of, as he put it, their own self-obliteration, to march off to war. He spoke of all of that, and then as the Union Jack began to pull back, eyewitnesses reported that he began to wail, great sighs of grief that were heard all across the adjacent hills of the Lake District. And then suddenly he stopped. And according to his son, who I found at the age of 94 living outside of Montreal, his father never again expressed human emotion. He went to his death with no interest in God, even though before the war he had been a devout Christian, a medical missionary in Labrador, part of the Grenville mission. And in the wake of the war, never would his children in his presence see the inside of a church, and he went to his death with only one abiding sentiment, and that was a hatred for all things German. And so obviously I wanted to know what happened to this man, Arthur Wakefield, who began the war a man of deep religious faith and ended it as a broken spirit. Unfairly, in fact, ridiculed by the climbers of 1922, because in 1922, he in fact replaced Tom Longstaff as the key medical officer on that most difficult of expeditions. So I looked into the files and I discovered that Arthur Wakefield had been a medical missionary in Labrador at a time when there were only 2 doctors in that vast area with a coastline of 5,000 miles. He had personally funded and armed the first militia of frontiersmen in Labrador. And when the war broke out, those frontiersmen became the nucleus of the legendary Newfoundland Regiment that sailed in August of 1914 as part of the contingent of Canadians that came over to train all through that hellish winter on Salisbury Plain. The regiment spun off to Gallipoli and endured terrible trials. Wakefield himself ended up at a casualty clearing station in France. Now, those casualty clearing stations were really the first point of respite for the wounded. In battles that had mortality and morbidity rates of 50, 60, 70, sometimes 80%, every battalion of 1,200 men only had 16 stretcher parties to evacuate the wounded. And so if you were wounded, it was really up to you to crawl back to your blasted trench line where your own aid station undoubtedly would have been obliterated. And so with your mates, you crawled, were carried, or if you could walk back to the casualty clearing stations, which were medical units, hospital tents, one just outside of artillery fire of the enemy. Here you went through a process of triage. If you were so severely wounded that there was nothing to be done for you, you were simply marked with a red cross and put into the moribund ward, and if you were lucky, given morphine and a cup of tea. If in any way you could walk or be carried, you were immediately evacuated to the hospital trains that carried you to the hospitals on the French coast and eventually by ferry across to Victoria Station, which became known as the Gate of No Return. For those who would die if they were not operated on immediately, but who could survive if they were, they drew the attention of the 8 surgeons who were attached to each casualty clearing station, 2 men at a time working in 6-hour shifts. The stress and tension on these men, my grandfather was one of them, is beyond imagining. Mallory's closest friend, Geoffrey Keynes, brother of John Maynard Keynes, who incidentally at Cambridge was known as the iron copulating machine, was famously operating in the dungeon of what had become a converted casualty clearing station they had made out of a dungeon on the mutilated genitalia of a British private when he paused to wipe his brow and he looked up and he saw his sovereign, King George V, right beside him in the acetylene torch lamplight. And Keynes just ignored his sovereign and went back to his work. Howard Somerville, famously on the Battle of the Somme, was told at his casualty clearing station to expect perhaps 1,000 casualties in the first week of the battle. He walked out with one other doctor onto his shift and found himself surrounded by 6 acres of dying boys that he had to decide who was to live and who would die. He never came back from Everest. He became a medical missionary in the south of India and dedicated the rest of his life to saving the living that he might sweep away all memories of the dead. Now, going back to Wakefield, I was able to ascertain that he was at a casualty clearing station behind the Somme front, and although there was a gap in the records, and many of these documents had been censored, of course, he had written a postcard to his wife that referred to an architectural feature that allowed me to put him in Albert, the staging ground of the Somme in May of 1916. So I knew they weren't moving surgeons out of that staging ground a month before the biggest battle in the history of British arms up to that point. Through other avenues of research, I was able to ascertain that his beloved Newfoundland Regiment had actually marched through the town he was in to take up positions for the attack at the Somme right in front of his casualty clearing station, which by a remarkable kind of accident would be the place that he would be waiting to welcome his boys of Labrador, every one of whom he had literally, as one of 2 doctors in the country, brought into the world. And so when the attack happened on July 1st, which was the biggest debacle in the history of the British Army, the total capacity at the medical facilities of the British forces was 9,500, and by the end of the morning, the 4th Army alone had suffered 57,000 wounded, over 35,000 dead on the field, and that was the first day of a battle that would last 6 months. And so I found from Wakefield's journals that he spent the next couple of weeks, when the true extent of the disaster had been sort of masked by the mendacity of the British press and the general staff, he was walking through these seas of wounded to try to hear the familiar lilt of the Newfoundland accent that he knew so well, to see anybody wearing the blue puttees unique to the regiment, and he found no one. It was as if the entire regiment had simply disappeared, and that, in fact, was precisely the problem, because they had attacked on the morning of July 1st at 9:15 a.m., and it resulted in the biggest disaster in the history of any unit in the First World War. And any Canadian knows the story of the death of the legendary Newfoundland Regiment. And this is a short passage from the book. In the noise and chaos and horror of the battle, all communication collapsed. A false report of a glorious victory resulted in even more men being fed to the slaughter. At 9:15 a.m., the Newfoundland Regiment was ordered to advance. Their right flank hung in the air because the 1st Essex, the next unit in line, had been delayed reaching the starting point by the sheer volume of dead. Shells landed on corpses, and flying fragments of flesh and bone blinded the living. Men enveloped in flames went mad and fought each other as they died. The soldiers of Wakefield's beloved Newfoundland Regiment barely got out of their own trench, and when they did, they floundered and died on their parapet, their ranks swept by German machine gun fire. Those few who advanced slowed and faltered, burdened by their loads, leaning and bowing into the storm as if to limit exposure to the lead. The British artillery barrage, timed to the second, had long since moved ahead and away from the battlefield. Men dropped dead at every yard, and still the regiment pressed on. A few miraculously reached the German line, only to be shot down in the mud or skewered on the wire, which was not cut. Indeed, the last thought of many of these brave men, breathless with exhaustion, blood-whipped, and deranged with fear was a horrid realization that the German line was utterly unscathed. Nothing had been damaged at all. The preliminary bombardment had totally missed. In fury, they spun into the wire, tossing grenades, their screams baffled by the throaty gurgle men sound when hit in the brain. Altogether, 810 young men went over the top that attack, and only 35 emerged alive. To hear the British General Staff praise the unit to the Newfoundland Prime Minister, saying that it had been a magnificent display of trained and disciplined valor, and its assault had only failed of success because dead men can advance no further. Well, this is Howard Somerville, who himself at the Somme had that similar experience. Geoffrey Winthrop Young used to, before the war, draw all the poets and all the climbers and all the philosophers to this remarkable place in Wales, the so-called Pennypass gatherings, where by day they would climb, and by night they would sing and recite poetry and dream new dreams of a new century. And you must remember that we tend to think of the Victorian era as a sort of stultified era that somehow morphs into modernity and the Jazz Age. We forget there was this amazing 10 years of new dreams of hope inspired by a philosopher by the name of Moore, whereby for all of these guys, all that counted was authenticity, poetry, transparency, and truth. They were a kind of an experimental generation, which accounts for Mallory's, for example, love affairs with young men. It was all part of this experimental culture of all the new hopes and possibilities of the promise of a new century. So this is what, in fact, was crushed at the battlefields. And so this is a photograph of Mallory on the right and Siegfried Herford, who was the best rock climber in Britain, on the left, who was killed, of course, at the Somme. And Geoffrey Winthrop Young, when you look through this Pennypass diary of all the photos of all the young climbers who had come, no fewer than 23 of the finest climbers of Britain had been killed in the war, and 11 so severely wounded they would never be able to climb again. So when Tom Longstaff rather laconically said to the Everest Committee in 1920 actually, when they began to assemble the team for Everest, he said, "I'm afraid to say that the supply of young climbers is not quite what it was before the war." He was absolutely dead on. Now, if we step back for a moment, one of the things that I found I tried to do in this book, which is not generally done in the books you've read about Mallory, most of the books tend to focus on Mallory alone, when in fact each of the men who went on these expeditions were in many ways more interesting than Mallory. They also tend to keep these expeditions, as John Noel would have liked them to have done, isolated in time, like as if they had emerged from some kind of cosmic mystic space of Tibet. But in fact, from the very start, the effort to climb Everest was intricately connected to British foreign policy. And if indeed the war had informed and haunted the lives of the men, these Everest expeditions were never isolated adventures. They were imperial gestures woven into the very fabric of the Raj. Now, the Raj was this extraordinary phenomenon. You know, the entire subcontinent of India that contained a fifth of humanity was dominated by no more than 1,300 Englishmen in the India Civil Service. When Lord Curzon was famously asked why there was not a single native Indian in the Indian Civil Service, he famously replied, because there was not one man in the entire subcontinent capable of the job. The British never had more than 20,000 citizens in India. So if mercantile zeal, severe military reprisals, the co-optation of local elites all played a role in the maintenance of the Raj, what really held it together was the sheer audacity of the effort, the sheer gall of a small island nation that never set out to rule the world, but did so with such flair. The essence of colonization is to persuade the colonized of their own inherent inferiority. And at this, the British were extraordinarily successful. And they had indeed transformed the face of India. But the other thing you must remember is that India itself was a British invention, codified and brought into being by maps. It was a surveyor that really created the rationale for occupation. And so if the British had transformed the face of India, the mathematicians and technicians of the Survey of India really brought it into being, because maps were the key to the very notion of India. So it shouldn't surprise us that the greatest scientific experiment of the 19th century, the experiment that led to the discovery of the greatest mountain on Earth, was the literal measurement of India. At the time, geographers knew that the Earth was not a perfect sphere, but the degree of the distortion was uncertain, and it was of key importance to cartography and to navigation. And so beginning in 1806, the British set out to literally measure a single arc of longitude across the entire length of the subcontinent of India. To do so, they had to carry the most precise scientific instrument of the 19th century, these incredibly meticulous 1,000-pound brass theodolites that were carried in a process of triangulation up the entire length of India until they bumped into the Himalaya. And such was the wizardry of mathematics and of differential calculus that their surveyors and their mathematicians could literally look across the heights of the Himalaya to the peaks that scored the horizon, and with incredible accuracy measure those altitudes, such that the original estimate of the height of Everest only differs from the final GPS-driven calculation of Brad Washburn by roughly 40 feet. It was an extraordinary achievement. And it was, of course, through that the British discovered the highest mountain in the world. But the British weren't really interested in what lay beyond what lay in the mountains, but rather what lay beyond them. We forget that throughout the 19th century, while Britain had been expanding on sea, the Russian Empire had been expanding on land to the tune of 55 square miles a day for 100 years, bringing the Tsar right to the gates of the Raj. And this created this incredible point of tension known to the British as the Great Game and to the Russians as a tournament of shadows. It drove the British absolutely crazy that they had no way to communicate with the capital of Tibet, Lhasa, which lay but 250 miles beyond Darjeeling, a hamlet that sent tea to every village in the British Empire. And so Lord Curzon, who famously said that upon the frontiers of the razor's edge upon which empires rise and fall, sent 2 letters to try to open up a dialogue with the 13th Dalai Lama. When these letters were refused, he succumbed to his paranoid notions that the Russians were already in Lhasa, and he dispatched the Young Husband expedition first as a mission in 1903 and in 1904 as a full-out military invasion to take over Tibet, which Young Husband did. But in doing so, he only really created 2 consequences. One, he destroyed the Tibetan army, and secondly, he prompted China, which had been perfectly happy to let Lhasa lie dormant. He virtually obliged the Chinese to act. So when the Liberal Party in 1905 repudiated that adventure as a pointless imperial gesture, Young Husband comes back and the Chinese roll in. So the 13th Dalai Lama, who has fled the British to Mongolia, back into Lhasa, and now in 1909 flees the Chinese into the arms of Charles Bell in Darjeeling. Now the entire permission to climb Everest, to have a go at it in 1921, came about because of an arms deal that was worked out between Charles Bell and the 13th Dalai Lama, an arms deal upon which the future of a free Tibet would rest. And so there were plans, in fact, to attempt Everest before the war, because as Young Husband came back from Lhasa, there was a tremendous sense that something magical had been ruptured. The virginity of this mystic place had been violated, as John Buchan said. And as they came back on that retreat, there was a sense of replacing it with something. It was, of course, replaced by the soaring ridges of Everest they could see from Kampazong. So this thing morphed immediately, and Young Husband sent Cecil Rawling, Colonel Ryder, and the spy F.M. Bailey up the Brahmaputra to scout the approaches to Everest. And so Cecil Rawling had planned to attempt Everest in 1913, 14, and 15, but then, of course, the war intervened. But Young Husband, within a month of the end of the war, was already maneuvering to return to Everest. When the British Foreign Office and the India Office demurred, he felt he needed to push the situation a little bit. So he brought to the stage of Anolean Hall in the spring of 1919, again, mere months after the end of the war, this man, John Noel, the famous photographer, who in 1913, disguised by staining his skin with walnut juice, had slipped into Tibet to try to approach Everest from the south. And he came quite close until his party was intercepted by Tibetan cavalry, and he had to retreat to India. And of course, then he went through this horrific experience in the war, but he was brought forth in March of 1919 to speak to the general meeting of the Alpine Club and the Royal Geographical Society. And that night, as he came to the podium, he looked out over this hall of men in evening suits, and his eyes fell on those in khaki, because that night, 7 captains were elected to the RGS, all of whom had lived through the war. And only they could understand, as Noel later wrote, what Everest had become to him, a sentinel in the sky, and a place of hope and redemption, a symbol of continuity in a world gone mad. As he stood up, he paid host to Cecil Rawling, who was no longer with them. They all cheered for the lost hero, because Cecil Rawling had been at Passchendaele, the blindest battle of a blind war, where General Haig decided to attack across the mud of Flanders. He dropped 5 tons of shell for every yard of German trench, turning all of Flanders into a quagmire, such that the men who attacked had to jump off the bodies of the dead to avoid being swamped and drowned in the mud. In a battle that would last 6 months, they advanced the line but 5 miles and suffered 400,000 dead to do so, including Cecil Rawling, who was one of 42,000 who disappeared without a trace. At Passchendaele, 90,000 British boys were recovered so severely mutilated that they could not be identified. And so this was the moment when suddenly Everest came together. Charles Bell got permission from the Dalai Lama. You couldn't approach Everest through Nepal. It was shut off to the British. They had to go through Tibet, and it was only the arms deal was finalized in 1920 that allowed them to actually begin to seriously put together a team for Everest. Well, who is going to be on that team? Well, obviously George Mallory, who was a master of rock, the best rock climber to have survived the war, and the other man who had to be on the team, of course, was George Finch, who was to ice and snow what Mallory was to rock. And so both men were selected for the team, and they were about to sail for India when 2 weeks before their departure, suddenly the Everest Committee decided that both men had to go through a medical test. Mallory passes in flying colors, Finch fails terribly. This creates a tremendous scandal because not a week later in the oxygen chambers at Cambridge, he sets world records of endurance at altitude. What's more, the summer of the reconnaissance, while Mallory's in Everest, George Finch goes off to the Alps and sets records all through Switzerland. So the question is, why was this man kicked off the team? One concern was possibly because he was an Australian, Hincks and General Bruce, who wanted this to be an all-British team, might have done it simply because he was an Aussie. But that would have involved the complicity of Sandy Williston, who was the expedition doctor, a man who Mallory famously said was incapable of deceit. So this actually has been a huge mystery in Everest lore since 1921. Why was George Finch kicked off? Well, you know, sometimes the best research is done in military archives or the RGS, but the really juicy stuff is found at the divorce court records at High Holborn Street. The story really begins, first of all, when I looked at the medical chart of the Harley Street doctors, there was no evidence of pathology. They were basically just saying from a superficial exam that the man looked exhausted, his skin was sallow, he wasn't eating well, he basically looked like shit. Well, as it turned out, events in his private life had taken a tangled turn which would have unnerved the strongest of men. It began in the late spring of 1915 at an officer's dance when he met and soon married Betty Fisher, a 22-year-old aspiring actress pretty, coquettish. They had nothing in common save the moment they eloped, leaving as a return address no man's land. He shipped off to Salonika. She pledged her fidelity, a fidelity that lasted about a month. In the early part of 1916, he heard that his wife was dying in London. He secured compassionate leave, got back to London to find that Betty was not only not ill, but the proud mother of a young little boy that was most definitely not of his blood. So he went off to France, at the front, found the cuckold, thrashed him to the point of death, narrowly escaped a court-martial, came back to London, and secured Betty's pledge of fidelity once more. He goes back to Salonika. Her faithfulness lasts about 2 months. By this point, he doesn't really care because he's fallen in love with a nurse by the name of Gladys May. And so as soon as he can at the end of the war, he comes back to London to divorce the first Betty, and then, being a good gentleman, he marries Gladys May, the nurse, who by this point is in fact pregnant with a baby girl, with a baby kid who is most assuredly of his blood, but there's a slight problem. He doesn't love Gladys May anymore. He's fallen in love with Bubbles Agnes Johnson. And so he breaks up with Gladys May, who's not about to have this happen at all. She takes him to court, and he is ordered on March 2nd, 1921, by the judges to return to the bed of a woman who's about to give birth to his boy. Gladys refuses him to grant his freedom, so he does what gentlemen did in those days. He set up a moment of public scandal so egregious that she would have a choice between granting him freedom or keeping him by her side with a scent of scandal. And so he refused to go back, and he arranged on the night of March 15th, 16th, and 17th in room 477 of the Strand Hotel to commit very public adultery with 3 prostitutes. This left Gladys May, as intended, with the choice of either enduring the scandal or granting him his freedom, which she in fact did. His second divorce went through on December 12, 1921, leaving him free to marry his love of his life, Agnes Bubbles Johnson. And the second wife, Gladys May, was simply expunged from the record, and Finch's own children, including the first one who wasn't of his blood, Peter Finch, who went on became the famous British actor, never knew that she had existed. Now, it wasn't clear how much of this was known to the Everest committee, but in the rarefied world of London, the scent of scandal must have been in the air. But this much is clear. On March 17th, 1921, the very day of the medical examination, George Finch had a few things on his mind. 2 weeks previously, he had been ordered to return to the bed of a woman he disdained who was about to give birth to his child. Out of another disastrous relationship, he had inherited responsibility for a boy, now 4, who bore his name but was not of his blood. To get rid of his second wife, he had also promised to pay her 1,000 quid a year for the rest of his life, a lot of money for a man whose family money had been lost in the collapse of the Siberian Railroad and the Russian Revolution. And on the very day of the medical exam, he was scheduled to commit adultery at the Strand Hotel in a contrived setup intended him to free him to marry the woman of his dreams. So it's no wonder, as I write in the book, that he had lost his appetite, and that, as the doctors reported, quote, his complexion was sallow, his general appearance tired, his condition poor. So that is how, in fact, George Finch ended up not being with these men in 1921. Now, you look at this mob, they don't look exactly like your intrepid explorers. On the far left, for example, Sandy Williston, looking a little mousy. Beside him, in the pith helmet, George Mallory, Guy Bullock, the governor of Bengal, the extraordinary Colonel Howard Bury, and the irascible Scot Harold Rayburn on the far right. Well, let's just think about how mousy these men were. Start with Sandy Williston. In 1905, he responded to an advertisement in the London Times, and on 24 hours' notice, set off to travel 3 months just to reconnoiter and rendezvous with a British natural history expedition in the mountains of the moon in Uganda. He then spent 9 months in the jungle collecting plants. When it came time to leave, he thought, why go back the same way? So he decided to walk from the source of the Congo to the mouth, becoming the second man since Stanley to do it. 3 years later, he decided to climb the highest peak in New Guinea, and so he sailed to the island. On the way, he picked up 60 convicts, 40 Javanese soldiers. He bought 220 Dayak headhunters in Borneo, and he had scores of East Indian porters. This incredible army swept inshore, reached about 40 miles off the shoreline when all hell fell apart, and the men began to drop like flies, leaving in the end Williston and 2 other Brits, the only Europeans still alive. One was dying of malaria, and in his journal he describes this marvelous meal where they're on these packing crates, proper cutlery, of course, and napkins. And as Williston said, as the river, the swamp water, is rising in flood beneath them at their feet, he says, well, at least the one good thing is it wasn't too difficult to wash up tonight, you know. And, I mean, go over to Howard Bury. Howard Bury in 1905 stained his skin with walnut juice, slipped in disguise into Tibet, crossing the passes to Kailash. He later traveled throughout the Pamirs, Turkestan. He was always drawn to the sacred. He read the works of Krishnamurti, Kahil Gibran. He visited the Buddhist monks of Angkor Wat, the high priests and shrine guardians of China, the mystics of Tibet. In India, he stripped his skin off and anointed his body with oils, scented oils, and walked like a fakir down the entire length of the Ganga, and famously killed a man-eating tiger that had eaten 21 holy men. He was a brilliant writer, a great naturalist, in time the master of no fewer than 27 European and Asiatic languages. In 1913, on the eve of the battle of the war, he was in the mountains of heaven in Central Asia. He befriended a little bear he named Agu, carried this bear on his saddle for 6 months, took him home to his estate at Belvedere in Ireland, and as bears tend to do, Agu got very, very big, and Howard Bury's favorite form of exercise for the rest of his life was to get naked and wrestle Agu beneath the willow arbors of his estate at Belvedere. He was not a man made out for war, but he was a soldier, and he fought from the very beginning in every horrific engagement. He only went nearly mad once on the Somme front when he was ordered to build a communication trench to relieve soldiers at Devil's Wood, who that afternoon 4,000 British boys had died. He was sent out to dig a communication trench in the darkness, and he suddenly found himself with his men digging not through the chalk soils of Picardy, but digging through 8 feet of rotten flesh as he moved to his destination. He nearly cracked, and so when we find him on Everest, the leader of the expedition in 1921, moving on his pony toward Tingri, their first base of operations, as his mule clip-clops along the road, he sees this figure in the distance, seems to be standing and falling with the periodicity of a metronome. It turns out to be a Buddhist Mongolian pilgrim moving one body length at a time in ritual prostration from Lhasa to Kathmandu. It's an extraordinary affirmation of religious possibility, and as he went by on his pony, he looked to the left, and for the first time in the expedition, they saw the shearing light of Everest against the radiant azure sky, scoring that horizon. And so the expedition in 1921 begins in Darjeeling, goes up the Jelapla, to the Jelapla, through the Chumbi Valley, this tongue of Tibet that drops between Bhutan and Sikkim, following the very route of the young husband invasion until they get past the Tangla, and then they abandon the trunk road to the Tibetan capital of Lhasa and move out overland, walking off the map, as they say, 350 miles to eventually find themselves at Tingri, which becomes their base of operation. And on that walk through the jungles of Sikkim, here you see Noel Dell camped out in 1924. Eventually they reach the Tibetan plateau, and then a very curious thing happens. Arthur Kellis, 56 years old, high-altitude physiologist, too old for Everest, literally dies of exhaustion and is buried at Kampazong in the shadow of the peaks that he is the only European ever to have climbed. Now, in the course of this research, I made a number of remarkable and novel discoveries. Perhaps the most extraordinary was the journals I found. According to all historians, the there was only one set of journals kept in 1921. Now, just to refresh your memory, in 1921 it was a reconnaissance. The mission wasn't to climb the mountain, it was to find the mountain, map the approaches to the mountain, and map the inner massif of the mountain, to find a chink in its armor, a route to the summit. The journal by Guy Bullock, Mallory's schoolboy friend from Winchester, and his climbing partner is a curt thing that was published by the Alpine Club in early 1960s. People talk of Mallory's journals. He never kept a journal. He wrote letters to his beloved wife, Ruth. But I found the unsung hero of 1921 is in fact a Canadian, the first Canadian on Everest, a man called Oliver Wheeler, who had been seconded to the expedition from the Survey of India with a specific mission to map the inner massif of the mountain with a novel photographic topographical survey technique that his father, founder of the Alpine Club of Canada, had pioneered in the Canadian Rockies. So it was Wheeler who spent more time higher in the mountain, exposed to the wrath of the mountain, alone on the mountain in 1921 than any of the British. And it was Wheeler, not Mallory, who would find the key to the mountain, the doorway to the North Col, the route up the East Rongbuk Valley to the base of the North Col that Mallory famously described as the col of our desires. Now, I found Wheeler's son, John, age 77 at the time, living in Vancouver, 2 doors from the house that I was born in. I went to see him over the course of this marvelous afternoon. This wonderful Canadian gentleman suddenly pulled off his shelf 2 thick treasures, 2 thick bound journals that his father had kept in 1921 as he marched across Everest with George Mallory. No historian had ever seen these journals. On the day that Arthur Kellis is buried, Wheeler's journal entry reads thus: "Well, they buried the old boy in the morning. Thought it would be the afternoon. Terribly sorry to have missed it, but I do hate funerals. How do you miss the interment of one of your fellow climbers when 6 of you are walking 400 miles across Tibet together? There had to be an explanation. I knew it lay on the Western Front." Wheeler was a soldier's soldier. He graduated from Canada's equivalent of West Point RMC with every conceivable honor, including the Sword of Honor. He was with the 7th Mer Division of the Indian Army that sailed for France at the outbreak of hostilities. We forget that by November of 1914, within 3 months of the outbreak of the war, the British Expeditionary Force was utterly annihilated. The entire British sector of the front was held by the Canadians in the north and the Indian Army in the south. By that point, the topography of Armageddon had come into place. The trench lines reached the coast, and both sides were beginning to sap each other, building trenches at 90 degrees to the enemy line. It came to the attention of Wheeler's command that the Germans had put 2 saps within 30 feet of their trench line. Wheeler was given the command on November 14, 1914, to go over the top with 125 men as a Royal Engineer and to bury those saps, and to do so in a way that would dissuade the Germans ever trying that tactic again. He goes over the top, all hell breaks loose, and to their horror they discover the saps are full of Germans about to attack them. The result is a ferocious melee of hand-to-hand combat, which eventually leads to the Indians pushing the Germans back, but not before the sap, the trench line, is lined 3 bodies deep, chest to chest, boys of both sides, in their death throes, flailing about like trout in my kraal, as Wheeler would later say. And he, as a Royal Engineer, tried to get some of the wounded out, but in the chaos of the battle, he had no choice but to bury them all alive. So when he says on Everest, "I do hate funerals," you see how this war affects everyone on these expeditions. The war was never spoken about, never forgotten. T.E. Lawrence and Robert Graves famously made a deal never to speak about the war, but of course it was in the fiber of their being, the essence of their experience. So when they reached Tingri, there are 3 main initial explorations. Wheeler comes up the Nangpala, here to explore the western approaches to Everest. Eventually, they explore the Rongchuk Valley and the sacred home of Milarepa, the mystic saint Lapche, and eventually they will make their way to the east face through Karta, up the Gama Valley to the Kanchung face, and up the Karta to Windy Gap or the Lakpala. Mallory, of course, with Guy Bullock, make a beeline for the Rongbuk Glacier because they have heard of remarkable monastery, the highest monastery in the Tibetan world, the Rongbuk Monastery. Well, here you see the 1921 team looking somewhat worse for the wear, the one group picture taken of them toward the end of their arduous explorations. And so the first goal, of course, was to come up the Rongbuk Glacier. Now, what happened is Mallory reaches here. You can see that he went up to the West Rongbuk. He actually peered down on the Hillary route, and he immediately saw it as impossible. Not only was it precipitous to drop down, the Khumbu ice field was intimidating, but really held him back was the fact that none of these guys had front-pointed crampons, which had not been invented. So there was no conceivable way that they could take that western Khum without cutting steps the entire way. But from the head of the Rongbuk Glacier, Mallory had noticed this col, this saddle. And of course, these men were ridge walkers. They couldn't take on a face. They had to find a ridge that got to a ridge that led to the summit. The problem was the North Col could not be approached from the east. So the question was from the west. So how could you find your way to the other side? This really consumed them in 1921. And eventually, to jump ahead, having explored these routes, Mallory led them up the Karta Valley to the Lakpala, where they would eventually see this col. But the route that climbers to this day take is up the East Rongbuk Valley, and Mallory, whose job was to reconnoiter this entire region, was in fact extraordinarily mercurial, and not once but 3 times he walked past the mouth of the East Rongbuk and failed to explore it. Wheeler was a man whose job it was to map the inner massif. He was meticulous in his explorations, and it was he who took the effort to go up the East Rongbuk, therefore finding the route to the mountain. And the fascinating thing is that when Mallory first sees the North Col from Windy Gap, that very day he writes his beloved wife Ruth and lies to her not once but twice, that by saying that if only we knew where this glacier ended up. Well, he did know, because the sketch map from Wheeler that had come into his hands not 2 weeks before had told him exactly where it was. And so there's a lot of folklore about Everest. You know, you hear the story of Mount Everest, Chomolungma, sacred mountain, goddess mother of the world. Whatever mountaineer made that up must have got it from the back of a celestial seasoning tea package. It has no ethnographic or linguistic reality. In fact, Everest was not considered holy at all, which is one of the reasons the Sherpa were so comfortable climbing it. Similarly, you hear stories of the Rongbuk Monastery of having existed since time immemorial. It was actually built in the first decade of the 20th century by a charismatic Lama, Zatro Rinpoche, who was able to cadge money from all the wealthy Sherpa in the Solo-Khumbu Valley, who had become wealthy because the British had introduced potatoes in the 1870s, giving them this unexpected cash crop. But Zatro Rinpoche was a remarkable Lama, and in the course of this book research, I also wanted to tell the story from the Tibetan side. So I got hold of his spiritual autobiography, his Namtar, and had it translated by monk scholars in Kathmandu. And I also went and spent weeks living in the monastery of his spiritual heir, Tulsuk Rinpoche, at Thupten Choling, across the Nangpala in Nepal, because to be in that monastery was to be in Rongbuk in 1921, because the liturgical cycle never changes year to year. And it turns out that if Everest was not a sacred mountain per se, the landscape all around it was indeed revered, not only because of the presence of the monastery, but because Guru Rinpoche, when he transmitted the Dharma to Tibet at the behest of the Buddha, had literally sown sacred treasures in all these valleys, which became guidebooks for enlightenment, treasures that existed both in physical and metaphysical space. And these refugia, which gave rise to the idea of Shangri-La, these refugias themselves existed in metaphysical and geographical space, and they were seen to be one vast Buddha field anchored by the sacred peaks, and merely to enter into these valleys was to achieve illumination. This, of course, was unknown to the British, but this was the reality of the landscape. And so what happened in 21 is that Wheeler's revelation about the East Rongbuk did, in fact, come too late, because the entire momentum of the expedition had moved over to the Karta Valley. They made camp with great difficulty at the Lakpala Windy Gap and were rewarded with this first sighting from there of the col of their desires. They knew that if they get to the top of the North Col, about 23,000 feet, the shoulder led to the northeast ridge, where there did not seem to be severe impediments to reaching the summit of Everest. And so in 1921, the irony is Mallory, who famously hated Canadians. I'm Canadian. I don't even know how you hate a Canadian. I mean, but he did. But when it came time to drop from the Lakbala onto the head of the East Rombuk Glacier, traverse it, and go up the North Col, reaching heights that no human being had ever achieved, who was the one man he took with him? Oliver Wheeler, the Canadian, and with Guy Bullock. And the incredible thing is that they reached the height of the col, and they both estimated their arrival, and they were off by several hours, and they could be forgiven because what greeted them on the col literally shattered their senses. They first sensed it even below the lip of the col when each body began to glow in a kind of frigid halo, an aureole of spindrift, as Mallory described it. And as they crested the col, they were met with a wind that they said was like any other wind that any human had ever experienced. A maelstrom so mad that Wheeler literally thought the wind would suck the oxygen out of his lungs, and he feared that he would die. And he later wrote that the only way he survived was to put his hands over his face, slow down his breathing, and just as he had done in France underneath the blast of artillery, breathe between the concussions of the shells, breathe between the howling of the wind. They realized that they couldn't continue up the shoulder of Everest. They retreated down to the base where, in a very touching moment, Mallory would end up staying up all night to save Wheeler's life, whose legs had frozen to the hip, and Mallory stayed up all night rubbing those legs with whale oil, the man that he had so disdained, but the man that he invited him to go to the col of his desires. So now they had the route to the mountains. So 1922, when the mission was to climb the mountain, things would be relatively straightforward. Of course, the expedition members shifted around a little bit. This is one of my favorite, John Morris, a man who never set out to be a soldier, but did so very well. And like many of his peers, he wrote, he didn't respond to the patriotism of the outbreak of the war. It was boredom that led him to enlist, and a class structure impossible to deny that led him to be elevated against all military logic, as he put it, into the rank of the officer corps. He spent the entire war at the front, and what actually saved him was that he was able to enlist in the Indian Army toward the end of the war. And that led him to the northwest frontier, which now, as then, was a cauldron of conflict. And he and his command were ambushed not a month before he went to join General Bruce in Darjeeling for the 1922 expedition. Many of his men were killed. He fought his way to safety to the balustrade of a fortress, and then he stood up, forbidden by his commanding officer to go to the rescue of his men. And he began to peer into the setting sun, into the haze as the vultures circled the dead. And suddenly he saw, as he wrote, as he watched the shadows lengthen, he said, thinking yet not thinking, physically numbed and unable to move away. As dusk was falling, I noticed a solitary figure, moving very slowly and apparently with great difficulty. As he came near, I recognized one of my own men. He was stark naked. He had been knifed in the belly, and his testicles slashed. They now hung by bleeding threads of sinew. Within a month of that extraordinary experience, he would be in the Darjeeling Hotel as this man, General Charles Bruce, burst through the door like a bull, almost tearing the doors off the hinges, spewing a flood of fluent Nepali, saturated with curse words. And the only thing that saved Morris's reputation, as Bruce looked down at this sort of mild and bespectacled officer, was the fact that Morris himself could give it as good as he got. General Bruce was an extraordinary figure. At Harrow, he had set a record for being thrashed more often and more times than anyone in the history of the 1,000 years of the school. He was famous in India for having made love to virtually the wife of every one of the men in his Gurkha regiments. For exercise, he carried his adjutant on his back, running up and down the Khyber Pass. His favorite party trick was to rip a pack of cards in half. He served on the Gallipoli front, and he was machine-gunned so severely that his legs were nearly severed from the body. He was over a year in convalescence, and he was sent back to England and given strict medical instructions never again to climb stairs, and above all, never to walk uphill. Instead, he simply decided to climb Mount Everest. And in 1922, it seemed to be a no-brainer, a straight shot along well-trodden ground to Shegarzong, and not to Tingri, but now across the Pangla, a beeline for the Rongbuk Glacier. Here we can see that the team is very strong. Mallory on the far left, Moore's Head far behind, the great explorer, and of course now George Finch, who cannot be denied. And in Everest there were other incredible innovations, including oxygen, which was a interesting conflict for the men. They tended to fall into two camps, those largely who lived in London who had never climbed anything higher than their desks, who said that oxygen was unsporting. The more scientifically inclined, like George Finch, who was himself a chemist, or the Dr. Howard Somerville, viewed the use of supplemental oxygen as no more unsporting than seeking out a fine pair of climbing boots. But this was the big debate in 1922, with Finch as in charge of the oxygen party, and Wakefield. Here you can see John Morse, Wakefield on the left. I spoke of John Morse, General Bruce, Norton, Colonel Norton, Jeffrey Bruce, the cousin of the general. And the big debate was really between the Finch camp and the Wakefield camp. And here you can see them at the base of the North Col. Everything seemed fine, but then a real disaster unfolded. There was one initial attempt. And then, at a critical moment in the expedition, George Finch became severely ill with dysentery. And in a kind of moment of exasperation and pique, Colonel Strutt, the 2IC, authorized Mallory, Somerville, Colonel Norton, and Mooreshead to attack the mountain as a single party. And at this point, the British didn't realize that there were no second chances on Everest. And so what they effectively did is put all their eggs into one basket, sending all their best climbers, except for George Finch, up the mountain in what turned into a near disaster. And had it not been for a heroic arrest by Mallory, the four of them would have been swept to their death on that climb. And all of them came back, as you can see, severely debilitated by frost. Mooreshead would lose several fingers, Norton parts of his ear, Mallory himself suffering, and only the indomitable Howard Somerville without any wounds. So what does Finch do? He doesn't, having had no one to climb, he recruits to his colors Jeffrey Bruce, the cousin of the general, who has never been on a mountain in his life. And yet, with the guidance of Finch, who had invented the down jacket for this expedition, they actually set a height record that held through the next year. And had it not been for Finch deciding to abandon the mountain in order to save the life of Jeffrey Bruce, it's not impossible that Finch, had they not had such horrific weather, might well have summited in 1922. But one thing that had come out of 1922 was this divide between those who still use the language of war to describe climbing from those who lived through a war and had walked along the edge of death in such a way that they were prepared to accept risks that would have been unimaginable before the war, and it was exactly that kind of devotion that was necessary for Everest. In fact, George Finch famously argued that on Everest the margin of safety must be narrowed down, if necessary, to the vanishing point. And a climber in Everest, he said, must drive himself beyond exhaustion, even to destruction, if need be. And tragically, this is what happened as a consequence of George Mallory's final act of folly in 1922, when he insisted, against the advice of Tom Longstaff, and Wakefield allied himself with Mallory, arguing for a third attempt on the mountain. And as they approached the North Col, famously they heard the snow crack. The avalanche came down that swept the last 7 men in this column to their death. And this is a photograph taken about an hour before that debacle that sent them all back to England, haunted by the power of this mountain. And so finally we come to 1924. The team has been shifted around once again. You see George Mallory, beside him Colonel Norton on his left, Noel Odell, a remarkable climber, joining the expedition, John MacDonald, the translator, and of course on your far left, standing Sandy Irvine, and then below Howard Somerville, Hingston, Jeffrey Bruce, and I can't remember who that is. Anyway, Odell is a remarkable addition to this. He, of course, has gone through the war. He loses a brother in the war. To give you a sense of how they treated death, which will echo at the end of the story this evening, in his war diary, which I have a copy of, on the day that he learned that his brother had died, December 18th, 1916, his journal entry simply says, "Stayed in hut till tea time, when went across to mess until bedtime, tonsillitis better, Eric wounded by trench mortar bomb, died 20th." That's all he says about his dead brother. Now, Sandy Irvine was recruited to the expedition by Noel Odell, who had been with him in Spitsbergen, and given the tragic fate of Sandy Irvine, just 22 years old, his inclusion in the expedition has always been a source of controversy. There have been people who said he had never been on a mountain. It's not really true. He had been tested on Spitsbergen. He had been tested in the cliffs of Wales. What drew the people to him was his sheer extraordinary physical strength, and physical strength counts a lot more on Everest than technical prowess with a rope. The prurient notion that Mallory had sexual designs on the young Irvin, which has actually been promoted by some Everest historians, reveals an extraordinary misunderstanding of both Mallory's sexuality and of Irvin's libido. George Mallory had one physical sexual encounter in his life with James Strachey in a room of a friend that I name in the book at Cambridge. It is true that everybody in England wanted to bed him. Eddie Hassels, Winston Churchill's secretary, certainly Lytton Strachey, James Strachey, Duncan Grant, Hobhouse, I mean, just about everybody. But this kind of sexuality at Cambridge before the war is part of the experimental culture that slipped away. By 1924, Mallory was 27 years old, happily married, father of 3 wonderful kids, and anyone who knew Sandy Irvine knew that he was wildly and devilishly heterosexual. In fact, I haven't been able to locate one mother of one of his friends at Oxford who Sandy did not bed. And so if these men were drawn to Sandy, it was for a much more subtle and in a way beautiful reason. Sandy, born in 1902, never had to fight in the war. He was 16 years old when it ended. It's not like the war didn't touch him. He lost a cousin, and his own brother was splattered with mustard gas, wounded so severely that the family would have to change the wounds every day for the rest of that man's life until he died in 1965. Odell and Norton had both lost brothers at the front. Somerville had struggled through acres of dying boys. Mallory and all of them had borne witness to the carnage, and if they were powerfully drawn to young Irvin, it was because in some way, in his innocence and vitality, he represented the reasons they had all fought and the reasons for which so many of them and their friends, so many of their friends had died. Here's Noel Odell, who famously saw Mallory on the last assault. Sandy Irvine, of course, another reason he was brought to the expedition was that he was a mechanical savant. We probably would think now that he had dyslexia, but even as a young schoolboy, he had sent a design to the War Office for the invention of a gear system that allowed a machine gun to fire through a propeller, and the Army, the War Ministry could not believe that this was coming in to them from a teenage boy who had just made it up on his own. Here's Mallory and Sandy scanning the mountain from the Pangla. They're making a straight move to the mountain. In 1924, the snow conditions were absolutely horrific. They had been at Rongbuk for over a month before they even got a camp established at the head of the North Col. And then they made 3 attempts, and the death, the difficulty, forced them not once but 3 times back to seek the support of Zatra Rinpoche, the blessing that might inspire the men. They returned to the North Col, and here you can see the famous photograph taken of Colonel Norton by Howard Somerville as they established a height record on the second of the climbs. On that climb, Norton famously forgot to use his goggles, so as he ascended what now is known as the Norton Couloir, when he had to turn around, all his adrenaline was lost. Howard Somerville had to hold him by the hand as he moved back, now with the beginnings of complete snow blindness, and he's moving down the mountain. He passes Howard Somerville, and Howard Somerville himself suddenly begins, he can't breathe, and he begins to choke, and he does a kind of pounding Heimlich maneuver and ends up coughing up the entire frozen lining of his throat and larynx like a placenta onto the snows of Everest, bleeding profusely from the mouth. He simply keeps walking to keep up with his companion, Colonel Norton. And when they get back to the North Col, Norton is completely hors de combat. He's in agony with snow blindness. He can't leave the tent. Somerville is escorted down step by step the precipitous North Col by Hingston, the doctor, again a man who had never been on a mountain, leaving Mallory to lobby Norton for one last final attempt with oxygen, with the workhorse of the expedition, Sandy Irvine. And this is the last photograph of them taken alive. They move up the northeast ridge and have to deal with the first step and the second step. Noel Odell, some 2,000 feet below, sees them cresting what he thinks is the second step, 2 small black dots moving strong for the summit when the mist rolls in, and they are never seen from again. When it became clear that the men were dead, Norton said this: "We were a sad little party, but from the first we accepted the loss of our comrades in the rational spirit which all of our generation had learnt in the Great War. And there was never any tendency to a morbid carping on the irrevocable. But the tragedy was very near. As so constantly in the war, so here in our mimic campaign, death had taken his toll from the very best." And that night, as they moved away from the mountain, and when they finally abandoned the mountain, they were camped above the Zakarzu with a final view back beneath the spectral light of a full moon onto the entire north face of Everest, cradling the Rongbuk Glacier. And one of the men looked out of his tent that night and spoke for all when he said, "I could see the whole of the historic ground, the scene of the protracted adventure, spread out like a map and bathed in soft, full moonlight." That night, and with that scene in front of one, it was quite easy to realize that the price of life is death, and that so long the payment be made promptly, it matters little to the individual when the payment is made. Somewhere up there, in that vast wilderness of ice and rock, were 2 still forms. Yesterday, with all the vigor and will of perfect manhood, they were playing a great game, their life's desire. Today it is over, and they had gone, and this is a key line, without their ever knowing the beginnings of decay. Could any man desire a better end? And that really was the spirit, because there's 2 things you forget about that war. First of all, how noisy it was. At Waterloo, 20,000 cannon shots were fired. At the Somme, the British had 1,500 guns, each firing 1,000 projectiles a day. It was not uncommon for each side to fire at each other 1 million shells over the course of a battle, a single day. And the other thing you forget is how much it smelt. These men had to live with rotten flesh all day, all night, throughout the entire war. And so that's what this remark really is referring to. These men are frozen in their destiny. And the question, of course, comes up, did Mallory make it to the top or not? There's been a lot of revisionist thinking about this. I tend to go back to Conrad Anker, who found Mallory's body. And in his book, written with David Roberts, he lays out a pretty compelling case for as to why Mallory could not have gotten to the top. There are any number of reasons. First of all, we knew that the men were severely debilitated. They had lost their stove. They had no way of melting ice or snow. They were profoundly dehydrated. The torch left in their highest camp suggests that they probably left in daylight. When Dave Hahn and Conrad famously climbed the mountain, they had left at 2 a.m. and they got to the top, but they returned at 9 p.m. Both of them found that crampons were essential to their efforts. Crampons could not be worn in 1924 because of the nature of the crampon caused frostbite in the feet. And the severity of the second step was, I think, beyond the capacity of Sandy Irvine. We know from the discovery of the oxygen bottle that they got to the base of the first step. We know that they were roped up at the time of the accident. We know that Mallory would never have abandoned a climber on the mountain. He had said as much to Somerville. And my thought is that they probably would have turned back from the second step. But as Conrad points out in his book, there was one enticing possibility. Had the snows that battered the expedition in 1924 so severely that they had to retreat not once but 3 times from the base camp at Camp 3 at the foot of the North Col, had those snows accumulated on the northeast ridge, as they apparently did in the fall of 1986, albeit in the autumn, it's not inconceivable that a cone of snow might have formed that would have served almost as an inclined plane, allowing them to overcome that second impediment with the very speed that Noel Odell so famously reported. That's all speculation, but one thing that is not speculative is that if Mallory had managed to overcome the impediment of the second step, absolutely nothing would have kept him from the top of Everest, because he would have walked on even to his end, because for him and for all of his generation, as I've said, death, and this is a quote from a young soldier writing home to his father, trying to explain the nature of being on the Western Front, Billy Grenville. He wrote his father and he said, "Father, out here, death is a frail barrier that men cross smiling and gallant every day." A week later, Billy was killed. His own and his body never recovered. His brother Julian, a wonderful poet, died 3 weeks later. But all of these men had seen so much of death that life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And it would have been that spirit that would have carried Mallory to the summit of the world. And whether he reached there or not is really not that important a question. What these men achieved in their time is beyond the imaginings of those of us today. And they had a level of grit, determination, honor, and a kind of integrity that kept them from littering the world with themselves. These were not men prepared to yield their feelings to analysis. These were a kind of man and a kind of person that I think we may not see the likes of again. And so in that sense, I think we're just very grateful to be able to look into the past and learn some of the intimate details of these wondrous figures who first flung their spirits against the highest mountain in the world. Thanks very much. I'm sorry I went, I'm Irish, so actually I have an excuse for going on too long. I once in Canada on a national radio show said to the host to make a long story short, and she interrupted me and she said, "Too late." So I appreciate your patience, and I know some of you may have to rush off. We'll do some signing, but if anyone's got a few questions, do you have time for questions? Or?
Couple questions.
Yeah.
Raise your hands if you have a question.
You know, the war thing is so fascinating because when one of the, just a quick story, when Mallory's body was found, I signed this contract 3 months before they found the body, and there were when the body was found, as you'll remember, it was a sensational development, and there were literally 10 books out within a year. And I actually went to Knopf, who had given me the biggest book advance in the history of any book on mountaineering, and offered to give all this money back. Because I said, I'll do a lot of research. And they said, we didn't give you all this money for a book on Mallory. We want a book by you on Mallory, so get on with it. And I flippantly said, it's going to take me 10 years. But I ran into Peter Gilman, who had been given he had been given an assignment to do what turned out to be a fine biography of Mallory. I ran into him at Banff Book Festival, and he, being British, he pip and fap for a while and got around to the key question: when's your book going to be finished? And I said, well, listen, man, I haven't started. And he lost all his British reserve and literally began to scream at me at the top of his lungs, you mean I've been thinking about you every day for the last 18 months and you haven't even started your book? And I said, you should thank me for it, man. I mean, your book's finished. I'm not started, you know. But then he took a breath and he got his composure. And we had a mutual friend, Ed Douglas, at the Alpine Club, and he said, well, I've talked to Ed, and I understand you're looking into this war angle. I tell you, I've looked for it, it's not there. And of course, what he was saying, I mean, I'm not trying to be critical, his book's wonderful, but he was saying was that he thought that I somehow naively was suggesting that Mallory and the boys, sat around the campfire in Tibet and talked about Passchendaele. Well, of course they didn't. I mean, that's why I said T.E. Lawrence and Graves famously made a deal never to talk about it. But Robert Graves could never ride a train again in his life. He could never be in the presence of fresh-cut timber. He could never walk across ground without reconnoitering it to see how he should fly. The backfire in a car would send him flying to the ground. I mean, Robert Graves, who famously at the Somme suffered wounds that literally put shrapnel right through a hollow through his body, crushing his lungs. He was left to die. His name turned up in the Times as one of the victims, and he was literally flung into a pile of dead men and found in the morning breathing. And still, even though he was alive, such were the casualties that he had to rest and stay alone, dying still, 5 days in the hot sun before he could get treated. And so, of course, he didn't speak about the war, but it was never spoken about, but never forgotten. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Well, I think what we should do now is thank Wade for that amazing account of history and of the mountain. And the research is just phenomenal, and your knowledge and your storytelling and your